She was 18 years old when a freight clerk knocked on the door of the boarding house and asked, in a puzzled sort of way, whether anyone still living had any connection to a blacksmith named Ezra Hale, dead now these 20 years, because a shipment consigned to him had finally, after 2 decades lost somewhere in the freight company's own tangled records, come due for delivery. We want to tell you about her tonight, about a young woman named Corinne Hale, and about the crate that arrived for a dead man, and about what she found inside it once she worked up the courage to open it. Settle in with us, and before we go any further, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight, because we like to picture all of you out there together, listening to the same quiet story in all your different corners of the world. Stay close through this one. It moves slow at the start, the way the true ones always do, and it earns what it gives you by the end. And if these long, quiet frontier stories are the kind you come back for, we'd be glad to have you subscribe before we go on, so the next one finds you when it's ready. Corinne Hale had never known her grandfather, the blacksmith Ezra Hale, who had died 20 years before her birth. But she had grown up on the stories of him the way a person grows up on stories of weather that happened before they were born, half memory and half legend, passed down through her own father until he too was gone. Ezra Hale had come to the small rail town of Bitter Wells as a young man, before the town had much more than a stage stop and a well to its name, and had built, over some 30 years of steady work, the forge that stood at the edge of the main street, shoeing horses and mending wagon iron and, in his later years, when the railroad finally reached that stretch of country, doing enough contract ironwork for the rail company that his name was known, briefly, up and down 200 miles of line as a man whose work could be trusted absolutely. He had married late, a school teacher named Margaret, and had one son, Corinne's father Thaddeus, born when Ezra was already past 50. Ezra Hale died when Thaddeus was only 9, of a sudden apoplexy at the forge itself, collapsing between one hammer stroke and the next in front of 2 customers waiting on repaired wagon tongues, and the forge, without its master smith, was sold within the year to settle debts Ezra's widow had not known existed. Debts Margaret Hale spent the rest of her own shortened life quietly paying down, working as a seamstress, until her own health failed when Thaddeus was barely 16. Thaddeus Hale grew up, in consequence, with very little beyond his father's name and a boy's half-remembered stories of the forge. And he spent his own adult life as a freight hand and later a stable keeper in Bitter Wells, never quite able, despite trying more than once, to save enough to buy back so much as a corner of the ground his father had once worked. He married a laundress named Fay, and Corinne was their only child, and Thaddeus died when Corinne was 17, of the same sudden weakness of the heart that had taken his own father, collapsing in the stable yard on an ordinary Tuesday morning, leaving Corinne and her mother with very little beyond the small rented room above the stable where they had always lived, and whatever Fay could earn, taking in washing. Fay Hale followed her husband within the year, worn down, the town doctor said, by grief and overwork both. And Corinne Hale found herself, at 18, entirely alone in Bitter Wells, with no family left living that anyone in town could name, and no income beyond what she could scrape together doing the same laundry work her mother had done before her, in the same small rented room, which the stable's new owner allowed her to keep only so long as her rent stayed current, and made plain, in the careful, courteous way men make such things plain when they mean to be rid of someone eventually, that he expected it to remain current without fail. It was into this narrow, careful life that the freight clerk arrived one autumn afternoon, a man named Otis Prendergast, 42 years old, apologetic and faintly bewildered, holding a manifest that had, by his own account, only just come to light during a company-wide reconciliation of decades of unclaimed freight sitting in a regional depot warehouse 200 miles east. The shipment, the manifest showed, had been consigned to Ezra Hale, Blacksmith, Bitter Wells, 20 years earlier, paid for in advance, and had simply, through some clerical failure nobody now living could explain, never been forwarded. Sitting instead in a corner of a warehouse that the freight company's own records had, for 2 decades, somehow failed to properly close out. Otis Prendergast explained, standing rather uncomfortably in the doorway of the boarding house, where Corinne now took her single rented room, that the freight company's policy in such cases was to deliver to the nearest surviving relative of record, and that a search of Old Town registers had turned up Corinne Hale as Ezra Hale's only living descendant, and that the crate, a heavy iron-strapped affair the size of a small trunk, was presently sitting at the Bitter Wells depot awaiting her instruction, the company having decided, given the unusual circumstances, to waive whatever storage fees might otherwise have accrued over 20 years, which Otis Prendergast seemed to feel was a considerable act of generosity on the company's part, though Corinne, standing there absorbing the sudden strange fact that her grandfather, dead 20 years before her own birth, had somehow reached forward across that whole span of time to leave something for her to find, found she could hardly speak at all. She walked down to the depot that same afternoon and found the crate exactly as described, heavy, iron-strapped, its wood gone dark with 2 decades of warehouse dust but otherwise sound, and she had it carried, at the cost of a half-day's laundry earnings, up to the small yard behind the boarding house. And there, with the light beginning to go gold in the late afternoon, the way it does in that country in autumn, she worked the strapping loose with a borrowed pry bar and lifted the lid. We want to say plainly that what Corinne found inside was not, at first look, the kind of thing that explains itself easily. The crate held, packed carefully in straw that had gone brittle but had otherwise done its work well over 20 years, a complete set of a master smith's finest tools, hammers and tongs and punches of a quality Corinne, who knew little of smithing herself but had grown up hearing her father describe his own father's work, understood immediately were not ordinary tools at all. Beneath the tools lay a smaller wooden box, and inside that box, wrapped in oiled leather, a set of iron dies and stamps bearing a maker's mark Corinne did not recognize, and beneath those, at the very bottom of the crate, a letter, sealed in wax, that had somehow held its integrity through 2 decades of warehouse storage, addressed in a strong, plain hand to my son Thaddeus, or whoever of my blood comes after him. Corinne broke the seal that evening, alone in her small rented room, and read, by lamplight, the letter her grandfather had written some months before his death, though she did not understand, reading it that first time through, quite how much it would come to explain. Ezra Hale had written that in the last years of his life, as the railroad's ironwork contracts brought him more steady income than the forge had ever seen before, he had grown concerned, in the plain practical way of a man who had built everything he owned with his own 2 hands, that his son Thaddeus, still a boy of 9, showed no particular gift for smithing and might, in the ordinary course of things, never come to own the forge or the trade that had built the family's small standing in Bitter Wells at all. He had written that he had therefore ordered, from a fine tool maker in the eastern cities, a complete master's set of smithing tools and dies, of a quality far beyond what an ordinary forge required, intending them not for Thaddeus directly, but as an investment against the future, tools fine enough that whoever eventually inherited them, whether Thaddeus himself grew into the trade, or, as Ezra rather hoped, a grandchild he might never live to meet, would have, waiting for them, everything needed to establish a master smithy, without the long years of saving an ordinary smith's apprentice, required. He had paid for the shipment, the letter explained, from a private account he had kept separate from the forge's own finances, precisely so that no creditor or unexpected debt could ever claim the tools before they reached the family they were meant for. And he had written the freight consignment carefully, in his own hand, with instructions that the crate be held at the depot until called for by name, never anticipating, of course, that a clerical failure at a warehouse 200 miles away would swallow the shipment whole for 20 years. The letter closed with a passage that Corinne read over several times that first evening, and which we think is worth setting down here plainly. Ezra Hale had written that he did not know, writing this letter, who would eventually open the crate, whether his son grown to a man or a grandchild he would never meet, but that he hoped, whoever it was, they would understand that a trade honestly learned and honestly worked was worth more than any sum of money he could have left instead. Because money, he wrote, could be spent down to nothing in a single hard season, but a trade, once truly in a person's hands, could not be taken from them by any misfortune, and would feed them, and whoever depended on them, for as long as they had strength enough to work. Corinne Hale had never held a hammer in a forge in her life. She sat that first night with her grandfather's letter open on her knee, and the strange dark tools spread out on the floor around her in the lamplight, and she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was looking at an inheritance that could not simply be sold for whatever coin a pawnbroker might offer. Not because the tools weren't valuable, though they plainly were, but because selling them would mean setting aside the one thing her grandfather had actually meant to give her, which was not the tools themselves but the trade they were meant to open a door toward. It was not, we should say, an easy decision, and Corinne did not make it lightly or quickly. She spent the following weeks making careful inquiries around Bitter Wells and the smaller towns nearby, and learned that the smithy her grandfather had once owned, sold off 20 years earlier to settle the debts nobody had known existed, had passed through 3 owners since. The current proprietor, a smith named Garrett Voss, 58 years old, competent but unambitious, who had let the once respected forge decline slowly over a decade of indifferent maintenance, doing enough shoeing and simple repair work to keep the doors open, but nothing of the finer contract ironwork that had once made Ezra Hale's name known up and down the rail line. Corinne approached Garrett Voss, not to buy the forge outright, since she had nothing like the money such a purchase would require, but to ask, plainly, whether he would take on an apprentice willing to work for nothing beyond her keep and the chance to learn the trade properly, and whether he would be willing, in exchange, to let her make use of her grandfather's tools in his shop, since a smithy without a forge of her own was of little use to her yet. Garrett Voss, who remembered Ezra Hale's reputation from his own younger days, and who had, if we're honest, grown a little tired of the smithy's slow decline under his own indifferent hand, agreed, more out of curiosity than any particular expectation. And Corinne Hale, at 18 years old, began the following Monday to learn, with her grandfather's own tools in her hands, the trade that had built her family's name in Bitter Wells before it was ever lost. We won't pretend to you that it was quick or easy. Smithing is hard, punishing work, and Corinne spent the first year of her apprenticeship exhausted most evenings beyond speaking. Her hands blistered and then calloused, her arms aching in ways she had not known arms could ache. But she was, it turned out, quicker to learn than Garrett Voss had expected. And the fine tools her grandfather had chosen, dies and stamps meant for detailed contract work, rather than rough farm repair, gave her, once her basic skill caught up to the tools themselves, a capacity for fine ironwork that the smithy under Garrett Voss's own hands had simply never attempted. In her 3rd year of apprenticeship, Corinne began, with Garrett Voss's blessing and increasingly his direct encouragement, to seek out the same kind of contract ironwork her grandfather had once done for the railroad and the rail company's regional superintendent. A man named Holloway, who had heard the name Hale mentioned favorably by an older foreman who remembered Ezra's work from decades before, agreed to let her submit a sample commission, a set of decorative iron fittings for a new depot building going up at the county seat. The work, done with her grandfather's own dies stamping a pattern he had chosen 30 years before, for a purpose he could never have precisely foreseen, impressed Superintendent Holloway enough that the rail company began, over the following years, routing a steady stream of contract ironwork back through the Bitter Wells Forge, exactly as it once had in Ezra Hale's day. Garrett Voss, in his last years before retiring, made Corinne a full partner in the smithy, and when he retired at last, sold her his own remaining share for a price she was, by then, well able to afford. And the forge that had once been sold off to settle a dead man's unknown debts came back, 25 years after Ezra Hale's death, fully into the hands of his own blood. Corinne Hale kept, always, the small wooden box that had held her grandfather's dies and stamps, and inside it, folded now inside a protective sleeve of oiled cloth, his original letter. And she read it, in later years, to each new apprentice she took on, most of them, as it happened, young women the surrounding towns had not always thought to take seriously as candidates for a trade. Because she had come to believe, standing in the forge her grandfather built and her own hands had reclaimed, that the letter's plainest lesson, that a trade honestly learned could not be taken away by any hard season, was worth passing forward exactly as carefully as her grandfather had once packed it into a crate meant to wait 20 years for the right hands to open it. She hung, above the forge door, a small iron plaque of her own making, stamped with one of her grandfather's original dies, bearing simply the words Hale and Sons, though she had, by then, no sons at all. Only a growing line of apprentices she had come to think of as something very near family. And when townspeople asked her about the plaque's wording, she told them only that her grandfather had always meant the forge to outlast any single person's blood, and that she intended, as long as her own strength held, to make sure it did. On quiet evenings, Corinne still sometimes takes her grandfather's original letter down from its place on the forge's own small shelf and reads it through once more by lamplight. Exactly as she did the first night the crate finally opened after 20 years of waiting, and she thinks of a man she never met, choosing carefully, decades before her birth, to bet everything not on money that could be spent down to nothing but on a trade that could not be taken away. And she thinks, each time, that it was the finest gamble a grandfather ever placed on a grandchild he would never live to see. Corinne Hale was 18 years old when a freight clerk knocked on her door with a crate that had waited 20 years to find her. And she was not yet 30 when the forge her grandfather built, lost once to debts he never even knew he owed, came fully back into her own two hands. If this one sat with you the way we hope it did, we'd be glad if you left it a like before you go, and told us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and whether there's a trade or a skill passed down in your own family that outlasted every hard season it was tested against. We'll be back soon with another story from this same quiet country. Until next time, stay close.